I'm delighted to welcome all of you on behalf of the University of St Andrews, and in particular on behalf of the Institute of Legal and Constitutional Research at the university. Our purpose today is to take up a theme from previous sessions, that national government cannot suffice in providing a response to the climate crisis. We will therefore look at different elements in further responses: the role of law, the role of non-governmental institutions, in particular universities, and the role of individual and group activism. We're very pleased to have speaking to us a wide range of people associated with the university: honorary graduate, academic, student. And to introduce them individually and to chair this session, I'm very pleased to hand over to a regular participant in these meetings, Stephen Gethins, Professor of Practice in International Relations at the University of St Andrews. So, Stephen.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that welcome. Can I add my welcome to everybody? Thank you so much for joining us in St Andrews today, albeit remotely, albeit virtually. We wish that we could welcome you in person, but at least with my backdrop, we can assure you of a sunny welcome to St Andrews, which is not always the case normally. But thank you, and thank you to everybody at Scotia Group for organising today's meeting. It's a real pleasure for us to be hosting you here today. Esteemed guests, friends, we have a really good lineup of speakers for you today, and I'll introduce them briefly in a moment. But the issues that we're discussing today, and our topic is the UK as hosts of COP26, communities, nations, and the law, could not be more timely. The issue of climate change is a generational issue. It is perhaps the most pressing issue that faces any of us in this day and age. And whereas we look ahead to COP26, in some ways we also look beyond COP26 as well. COP will bring together decision makers from around the world. But I think one thing that's important for us to remember is that we all have a role and responsibility of rising to this generational challenge of climate change. The solutions are not merely to be found in talks between politicians at COP, important as they are and critical to all of our futures as those talks will be. These are to be found in our communities, at a local level, in local authorities, in companies, and in a wide range of stakeholders. And here at the University of St Andrews, this is a responsibility that we take seriously, both in terms of our responsibility to our community as an employer, as a large organisation in the east of Scotland, but also through our research and teaching as well. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers today to touch upon us. I'll be delighted to welcome Sir Ian Boyd, who's Professor in Biology and former Chief Scientific Officer at the Department for Environment in the UK Government, who's a good friend and colleague. Crucially, as we look ahead, I'm delighted that Leah Veeman has joined us as well. We'll be hearing from Leah later on today. Leah studied at St Andrews, and as well as excellence in terms of her studies over the past few years, I know from first-hand experience, both from my work as an academic at the university, but also previously when I was a member of Parliament, that Leah is not somebody who talks about climate change as something that is the responsibility of everybody else. It's something that she engages with and that she gets involved with, and has had highly successful in her work in climate strikes and in direct climate action. Leah, I'm not going to get the chance later on, but it's been such a pleasure having you here at the University of St Andrews, and I'll be really interested in hearing what you've got to say. But before that, I'd like to introduce Sir David Edward. Sir David is a former judge at the European Court of Justice. He is an honorary fellow at the University of Oxford, an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh. As John said, he's a regular collaborator at the Institute for Legal and Constitutional Research here at the University of St Andrews. And on a personal note, I should add that, crucially, he and I went to the same school. We both attended Perth Academy. So, Sir David, with that fine educational background that you no doubt have, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's my pleasure or duty, I should say, to speak about the law in the present context. And I think it's useful to begin by making some distinctions which lawyers make, but sometimes those who are not lawyers don't understand. And the first distinction I'd like to talk about is the distinction between law and what is called soft law. Normally, and in general, lawyers think that law is a set of rules or norms created by a body which is capable of making law, which will be binding and enforceable. In Britain, it's normally said to be the sovereign parliament that makes law which is binding and enforceable for everyone. But then comes the question, binding on whom? Is it binding on the members of the general public, or is it binding on some special group of people or organizations, local authorities, or individuals? And that links to the question of whether the law is enforceable by anybody. How is it enforceable? Is it enforceable in the courts? And if so, by what method? For example, there are rules of law which are enforceable in general, and breach gives rise to damages, but other rules which are only enforceable by what is called judicial review. Soft law, on the other hand, is generally thought to be to cover things like resolutions, guidelines, codes of practice, opinions, and so on, which are persuasive but not binding. So that is the basic building block of what we're talking about in the climate change context, the distinction between law and soft law. There's also the important distinction between national law and international law. National law is law made by the organs of the nation state. Again, in our case, by Parliament or by ministers under the authority of Parliament, or local bylaws, for example. Generally, rules made by the organs of the state are binding and enforceable, as I've said, but they are not always enforceable by individuals or groups, and we'll look at that in a moment. International law, in the classical understanding of what it is, international law governs the relations between states and the obligations of states. Originally enforceable really only by diplomatic means, but also more recently by the International Court or by arbitral bodies. There is limited scope for enforcement of classical international law governing the relations between states, and some people say that international law in that sense is simply soft law because can't be said to be enforceable. More recently, there has grown up various kinds of regional international law, and in our case, of greatest interest, human rights law, especially the European Convention on Human Rights, and EU law, the law governing the European Union, its institutions, and people who may be affected by EU law, who include, for example, companies that operate in the EU, although they are not EU nationals. The most effective method of legal protection is through individual or group action in the national courts. So let me give you some examples of that, and begin with a case in Switzerland decided in 2018 called the Climate Seniors Association. That was an association of people aged more than 75. And they called in the administrative courts for additional measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because, they said, the health of seniors over 75 were inordinately affected by the climate change measures taken by the government. And that claim was refused on the grounds that those over 75 are not affected in any particular way that goes beyond the impact on the general public. That is a rather traditional way of looking at it. Simply there may be an obligation, but you can't enforce it because you're not affected in a particular way. And there are plenty of examples in EU law of cases like that. The year later, in a case called Urgenda, the Dutch Supreme Court was dealing with a NGO acting on behalf of nearly 900 Dutch citizens. And they were claiming that the Netherlands had an obligation to adopt more stringent climate change policies and to cut greenhouse gas emissions more stringently by the end of 2020. They relied on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, various EU communications and decisions, and most importantly, I think, the Dutch Constitution, which gave them direct access to the Dutch courts. And the court did indeed hold that the Netherlands had an obligation to adopt more stringent climate change policies. Following very close on the heels of that is a case decided by the Hague District Court in May of this year, Milieudefensie and Friends of the Earth against Royal Dutch Shell. And there we have an action taken not against a government, but by a company or group of companies. And the way in which, the basis on which that action was led was because of an obligation in the Dutch Civil Code that companies cannot act in conflict with what is said to be what is generally accepted according to unwritten law. And the effect of that action was that the court ordered Royal Dutch Shell to limit the aggregate annual volume of all CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, which were due or are due to the business operations and energy carrying products of the Shell Group, not just Royal Dutch Shell, the whole of the Shell Group, and they must do so to such an extent that the volume will have been reduced by at least 45% by the end of 2020. So that's an obligation, so far it should be said, by the Hague District Court, imposing that obligation on Shell and the whole of the Shell Group. Again, in May of this year, in Australia, an action was brought by a group known as Sharma, representing children in Australia, against the Australian Minister of the Environment. And it concerned an application to expand and enlarge a coal mine in New South Wales. And it was held in that case that the minister had a duty of care under an Australian Federal Act for Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation, that the minister has a duty of care to consider the interests of children when deciding whether to grant approval. And it was pointed out that the effect on children of adverse climate change could be potentially catastrophic. However, the court did not make an order against the minister because the minister had yet to take a decision, and what the court held was that in taking that decision, the minister had this duty of care to children. Again, in April of this year, the German Constitutional Court was faced with an action by a group of German youth who argued that the Federal Climate Protection Act was unconstitutional because it set the targets too low. And the court made an interesting distinction between the effect of climate change on the current generations and future generations. And what the court held was that if the regulations allowed so much of the remaining budget of permissible emissions to be consumed, so much of the remaining budget to be consumed, that the future loss of freedom would inevitably assume unacceptable proportions, because there would be no time left for making further mitigating developments and transformations. In other words, you can't limit your obligation at present if the effect of limiting your obligation is to create a more serious problem for future generations. And the court, this is the German Constitutional Court, ordered that the legislature must set clear provisions for reduction targets from 2031 onwards, and that it must make these provisions by the end of 2022. In other words, and this is, I think, why this is so important, it's not just enough to look at limitations to 2030. You've got to have some clear target for 2030 onwards. So there's been a great deal of court activity in last year and this year. And there are currently, but I'll not take time to go through them, there are cases in Canada, a claim by an indigenous group, which was struck out but appealed. And there are other cases raised in 2021 in Mexico, Guyana, and the United Kingdom. What I think all this shows is that when you're discussing what COP26 ought to do, it's very important to be sure that it opens the opportunity for individuals and representative groups to take action in the national courts. It's not enough simply to make rules that apply between states. Thank you, Stephen. That's all I have to add just now.
Thank you, Sir David. That was incredibly insightful and and useful, and some important messages that have come out of that. Just to remind everybody before I move on, if you do have questions that you'd like to pose to any of the panelists, please use the chat function and we'll be looking out for those. But thank you, Sir David. Without too much further ado, I want to pass over to my colleague here at St Andrews, Sirian Boyd. I've introduced Sirian, but Ian's going to talk about governance challenges of the global climate crisis, the role of universities, with specific reference to the University of St Andrews. Ian, thanks for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you now. If you can. Hear me. I think.
So sorry about that. I couldn't unmute when I had shared my screen, so I'll just share my screen again. I apologize.
No,
let's get going. Good.
Thanks, Ian. And that's just the world we're in at the moment. Thank you. For
it is. It's lack of skill in controlling these systems. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to everybody today. What I'd like to do is try to look at the problem that we have through what I call the institutional lens. And that's to try and amplify what the scale of the problem is that we face and how we might respond to that at subnational scales. Net zero ambitions are becoming common among many developed nations, many nations of the world altogether. But what does this really mean in practice is a very difficult question to answer. It's one thing to set a vision and quite another thing to actually deliver on that vision. And Scotland, and I'll just find the slide changer. Scotland has, there we go, has set its course for net zero for 2045 and the UK for 2050. And the UK has enshrined this in law, the Climate Change Act, and in Scotland there is similar legislation. And Sir David has talked a bit about the importance of some of that legislation. And that's a way of potentially cementing this into the systemic response of nations. Whether it actually does that or not is another matter. But it is actually far ahead of most other developed nations. So, you know, we can give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back in the UK to some extent, but the question is, does it really have the effect that are required? We have something called the Committee on Climate Change, which is the body that's meant to hold government accountable through Parliament, and it sets out a logical track to reach net zero. And repeatedly produces reports urging government to do more. And the promises that government makes are often not lived up to. So that we have a kind of, in my view and in my experience, having worked within government, we have a kind of paralysis brought on by the sheer scale of the challenge that governments face. Industrial sectors have transformed in the past, but rarely have they ever transformed at the kind of rates that they need to transform at in order to adapt to climate change, and never have they transformed in parallel in the way that we require them to do over the next 20 to 30 years. So when you're sitting in government and looking at this, trying to get your arms around it, it is actually quite difficult to know what to do. My view is that governments actually need to transform themselves, and that means their structure as well as their people, if they're ever going to achieve the kind of objectives set out in the Paris Agreement. And that's an enormously difficult thing to do. I saw the ambitions and attempts to transform government through the period of austerity we had in the UK, and actually very little change, despite a lot of activity and a lot of potential action. So it's one thing for the Climate Change Committee to state that change is needed, but when the body on the receiving end, which is government in this case, is broadly incapable of responding to the message, then appropriate action is unlikely to materialise. Adding to this difficulty, climate is not the highest priority on most governments' lists. Unfortunately, we would want it to be, and many of them state that it is, but it actually a lot of the time isn't. They have to cope with many different trade-offs, and in pushing governments to do more, it's important to understand the constraints that those governments are actually having to face up to and realistically assess the prospects of success, which in my view are quite small actually, and the consequences of not succeeding are something that we actually need to prepare for the future. The result, of course, is that we get a sluggish response because national governments and the institutions and people they represent are hedging their bets most of the time. And this will be reflected in lack of future resilience to the challenges from climate change. But actually, there's a moral imperative for action. So what can we do? And this is what brings me to the institutional level. I suggest that governments are so paralyzed that they then fail to lead. And institutions, whether commercial or corporate or non-profit, are the backbone of society, and some need to step up and take the initiative. Everything from airlines to universities are now setting net zero targets, so they are doing that to some extent. Some are definitely more serious about this than others. I think there's a huge amount of tokenism in the language that goes on. But for sure, nations will never reach their net zero target unless their component institutions actually do likewise. So that's where the rubber hits the road, really, for many of us, because that's where we, as individuals, as members of society, start to interface with the real challenges that exist. And I want to reflect on the experiences we've had so far in the University of St Andrews to set a course for net zero. The first thing that we've done is actually set a strategy, and so our ambition is to set the course for net zero for 2035, which is 10 years in advance of the stated government goal. Because if universities can't achieve net zero, then it's unlikely that anybody else is going to be able to do that. So they need to be able to demonstrate how it's done and demonstrate leadership as a result. So how do we do that within universities? Well, this is the experience of the University of St Andrews, and I know that many other universities have similar kinds of plans, and many other organizations as well. But we have set it out in three basic tranches of activities. One is governance, and in that respect, we've set up an environmental sustainability board, which is representative, as representative as we can make it, of the whole university institution, which is a collegiate structure. Because this isn't just about top-down leadership; it's actually everybody in the institution has to buy into the changes that are going to have to happen. We have to set objectives, and in setting those objectives, there's a moral imperative sits there, which sets out that this is actually about more than just carbon. I think if we focus on carbon, we're not going to make our objectives. This is about environmental sustainability overall. So it's about water, it's about waste, it's about all the issues around biodiversity and the trade-offs there are between the way we produce our food and the impacts that we have on the environment and biodiversity as well. So there's more to this than simply just meeting carbon targets. And then, of course, there's delivery and planning, and that's about creating the business cases for change. The big business case is made. You know, that's why governments have set net zero by 2035 or by 2045 and 2050. But we need to divide that down into the actual operational business cases to actually transform an institution. And it's not just us that have to do that. I think an immense number of different institutions need to do that as well. in our case, that translates into changes at operational level, and that's about built infrastructure, why we buy and what we buy, and it's about behaviours as well. But of course, universities have a broader set of objectives and reach, and they can do that through their teaching. So our educational structure is gradually being transformed into one which will focus on trying to deliver students out there into the workplace with a very strong view of what it means to be sustainable and how to bring about sustainability. And then, of course, research, which is trying to provide those solutions that we need, both in the universities, at the university scale, but actually scaled up to the whole of society as well. So all these things are important, but just looking specifically at the university itself, and I look at the university simply as a microcosm of the kind of challenges that exist in pretty much every institution there will be, not just in this country, but around the world. This is the pie that divides up our impacts, our carbon impacts. And you'll see that there are different sections here. There's one for travel, which is pretty big. There's one for procurement, it's pretty big, construction, electricity, heating, etc. But fundamentally, all the bits to the right of the line are bits that the university has real control over. And all the bits to the left, the university does not have much control over. In other words, they sit mainly in supply chain. And of course, what you will notice is the bit to the right that we really control is really quite small compared with the bit to the left. And this is where tokenism tends to come in, because many institutions only focus on the right-hand part of the column. You could say that if every institution does that, then the left-hand part, which is supply chain, kind of looks after itself. But in reality, we in the university at least don't believe that. And so we have said that we will actually look after all our emissions. That's the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and we will reduce them to net zero. The result of that is that the university actually, by 2035, needs to be absorbing carbon, not emitting carbon. And if we cannot do that, then we're not playing our part in the role to get the whole nation to net zero. So just to finish off, what's the messages from our experience? Well, the accountancy processes that currently exist can create disincentives. For example, the university has found itself doing things for moral reasons and not because government has set out appropriate targets and a level playing field. It's also not enough to just reduce, replace, and refine. In other words, just reducing how much carbon you emit and replacing things is not enough. You actually have to absorb carbon. So we need to actively get on with that job. And at the university, we are currently putting in place a business case or actually an action plan to plant a forest. But therein lies a problem, because there is over demand for these opportunities for offsets and for absorbing carbon. We also know that if everybody just focuses on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, then we will fail. And that's very obvious from the kind of analysis that we've done. The other thing is that individual institutions like the University of St Andrews are simply too small to act alone. But we are within a much larger sector, and we can influence government, and we need to galvanize a sector-based response to this in order to be able to drive the supply chain to become more carbon neutral. So just to summarize, overall, institutions like universities are going to be an engine house for transformation. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think they need to do this as individual institutions, but also as a sector. And unlike any other institutions, they have universities in particular have the longevity to see this through. We're talking about institutions that need to see this through for 50 or even 100 years. St Andrews is 600 years old. It needs to be able to see this through and to help society see that through as well, because it has the intellectual authority to occupy the national and international high moral ground. So they need to lead, basically. And with that, what I'm going to do is turn to the future leaders and a future leader who is, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, is a student or former student from University of St Andrews, who has been setting this agenda in a very upfront way. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Leah to describe her view of this problem and the solutions. So Leah, over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lovely introduction, both to Stephen and Ian. Yes, let me share my screen and let's get started. I'm really excited to talk to you all about community governance and the importance of eco-activism. And yeah, let me just dive right in. A little bit of a roadmap about what I want to talk about quickly. I'm going to start with defining community governance and eco-activism, just so we're all on the same page, know what we're talking about, and then dive into why I think this is particularly important for addressing climate change, and then looking how can we create this change and how can we lead change and create visions for the future, and then conclude with some action steps for change. So, community governance. Community governance is a form of leadership and decision-making that is executed by community members and that aims to create change for the benefit of the whole community. It fills a governance gap within the larger environment and market structure, and it typically focuses on grassroots activism and involvement of the community. And since communities and citizens are those that at the end of the day are affected by climate change, it's important that we think about how can we allow citizens to have a greater say in their future, which leads me on to eco-activism. I see this a little bit different to environmental or climate activism because it doesn't limit itself to the protection of the natural world, but it looks at social justice, ecology, and political change. And for me, it's about acknowledging that link between humans and nature and recognizing that protecting the planet and the environment is also about protecting and ensuring our survival. Because at the end of the day, nature doesn't need humans, but we need nature. So, why are community governance and climate activism necessary? If we talk about climate change and climate action, I think it's important to question why we haven't seen large-scale international efforts in changing the system. Why is it that governments are failing us? Why have humans known about climate change for at least 50 years, and yet we haven't successfully addressed this, despite the Conference of the Parties meeting for almost 30 years now? And why is it that despite a growing consensus on climate change, this does not necessarily reflect in the people that are voted into power or in the societal changes that we need? And these are big questions, and I don't want to claim that I know the answers to them, because I don't think there is necessarily just one answer. However, what all of this really does make me think is that I think we've become really comfortable in a hot pot, especially if climate change does not affect us as it does people in other areas of the world and people in less privileged situations than our own. And I think that is something that we really do have to put to mind and be aware of when we talk about climate change. Just to clarify what I meant with in a hot pot, I'm sure many of you know the boiling frog metaphor that is often used with regards to climate change and climate denial, but I want to dive a little bit deeper than climate denial necessarily, because I think it's not just about denial. And just so everyone knows, in case you haven't heard it, apparently I've not scientifically tested this. Please don't do this. It's not very animal friendly. But basically, if you put a frog in a cold pot of water and slowly boil it, it won't jump up because it's such a gradual change and until it's really too late. And that's, yeah, it's quite a I guess, a little bit of a gruesome story, not very vegan friendly, so I apologize. But I think that's what we humans are really doing with ourselves. And I think that there are a lot of people that are either really comfortable in their little bubble bath, or on the other side, we have people that are so uncomfortable in the hot water already that climate change is not the first thing they can think on, act on every day, because it's become such a big issue that's so much societal and social factors have flown into this. And I think more importantly than that, actually, those people are rarely in the position of power and influence to create the large scale change that we need, which is why we're talking about community governance and community activism, and why I think it's so important. And I think I would argue that the only reason why we are seeing some real changes and actions towards climate change in the world is because of activism. It is because of young people that are striking, protesting, speaking up about this. Of course, also frontline environmental defenders that have worked on this for a really long time. And of course, timing is super important as well, because we are seeing more of the effects of climate change that are becoming more evident. However, while recognizing that activism is so important, I think it's also important that we discuss that activism is difficult to keep up in the long term, and yet it is a long-term activity. And people can start feeling unheard, or even worse, start losing hope. And I think that's why we really need to address, well, how can we make and create sustainable situations for community governance and for activism? And I've personally been an activist for almost 10 years now. So I started when I was really young. And it's only recently that I'm feeling like, okay, I have some form of platform, some form of voice and way that I can get heard, that I can make a difference. And I think some people think that activists just like to make a noise on the street, or get recognition for it, or because it's becoming in and friends are doing it, which, by the way, is important because movements are created through communities and connections and timing. But ultimately, what I think keeps people in activism is if they're actually given the opportunity to create change. And we need people to stay in activism, because that's how politicians are called into actions. That's how politicians are held accountable. That's how society's saying that there's a backing for this, that their society wants this change, that we are ready for this change. And yet, how can we create this in a way that is sustainable? And I think here's something that is important just to say, that I think maybe the University of St Andrews been doing really well with the ESB, and that's giving students not only a voice at the table, but actually tools and support to create change, because like I said, I think that is so important. And yes, young voices are often included in things like the COP and the Conference of the Parties, and there's almost always some young activist that's invited to speak at such an event. But I think that young people are still very rarely given the actual tools and power to envision and implement change. And to drive off this note of visions, it's not just about voices, although that is important. But I think more important is about empowering action and daring to allow young people to criticize and question the current system, and engaging in that intergenerational discourse. Because often young people are taught the concepts and the visions of the old world and the old system that continues to drive us deeper into the climate crisis. And I mean, I think back when I was at school, and yes, subjects like biology and geography did inspire me to dedicate my life to addressing this existential crisis. But even then, I chose this subject because it's something I was interested in. And also, I had no idea about how interlinked this crisis is with everything that we're seeing in the world, and how much the current system really needs to be challenged and completely transformed. And I think here also really, I want to make a note and say that I think education is probably the most important tool that young people are given for the future, apart from actually safeguarding a habitable planet for that future, of course. But I think we need to really question who the current system and education system is serving. Is it teaching us the principles of an old system that no longer serves us, or is it radically inspiring us to change the world? are we given the tools and the space to change our future? And that's something that a question that I want to leave with you to just think about and for us to ponder on. More practically, I want to look a little bit about how can we actually lead change and look at community governance, especially in relatively short periods of time. And for example, I was in a position as environment officer, which is also an elected position, which is just 1 year, and that's a short space of time. But when we look at climate change, we really have very little time left to create some really big changes. And I think reflecting back from over this last year, I think one of the best things that I did with my environment subcommittee, but also as chair of the student and community working group of the ESB, was right at the start was really visioning with my group or with my committee, either individually or as a team, and creating space and time to think about the change that could be created. And that's from really small to really big things, and really creating that mindset of abundance that reaches for the moon and knows that even if we miss the moon, we land somewhere between the stars. And I think we way too often, and we see this in the media all the time, that environmentalism is often talked about something that needs to be given up, that lifestyle changes that need to be happen and sacrifices that need to be made. And we need to really counter that more with positive visions of what we're actually aiming towards. What is that vision and that life that we're really trying to change? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about safeguarding and the environment or nature. Of course it is about that as well, but it's about creating a different form of life on Earth that is more in tune with the Earth, and that serves us and that allows us to have a future on this planet. So yeah, I know there's so much more I could talk about and so many more other steps that I could mention, but just 3 action steps for change that I want to draw up from just what this presentation is. Firstly, the importance of participating in activism. And with that, I don't necessarily mean strikes or protests, but I think activism is about using your voice and your vote and your talents and your vision for change. And I think the important part of the word activism is act. And I think we need to remember that. Secondly, visioning for the future. I just told you about this, but I think it's so powerful to get communities of people together to discuss the future that they want, and maybe even have some really uncomfortable discussions because people don't necessarily think about the future in the same way and think about climate action in the same way. But we need to find this ground, this discussion space, and work backwards from there and be like, okay, this is the vision that we're all working towards. And this really includes combining the arts and the science and highlighting the interdisciplinarity of climate change and how it's really interlinked with everything we do. And regardless of what, for example, I or anyone else as a student is studying, climate change will and is affecting all of us and all of our futures. So how does this all relate and go into wherever people end up going and whatever jobs or things people do? And I think also importantly, making sure that climate justice also means social justice and really uniting causes for that, for the vision of transforming our world. And then finally, I think the last point that I want to mention is giving young people not just a voice, but a seat at the table of their future. And I think that's definitely something that I hope, should be really taken forward. And I just want to, give thank you to St. Andrews for allowing me to do that in that last year. But thank you all for listening. I hope, this sparked some interest. I'm really looking forward to discussion. If you have any questions, here's also, I don't know if you want to contact me, I put some links on my website on here that you can jot down. And then I'm also going to leave you with a video link to Line in the Sand in 2019 about some community activism. If you wish, you can watch that in your own time to just be inspired and to ponder about this. But thank you so much for having me, and Scotia for inviting me. And that's me.
Thanks for that, Leah. That was really powerful. Thank you. Really appreciate that. So many important messages to draw from that in Ian's remarks on the role that we each have to do as individuals, but also as institutions, and Ian talking about the university as a microcosm. But Leah, that was incredibly important, what you had to tell us. You know, nature doesn't need humans, but we need nature, and those 3 points about participation. History is made by those who turn up, those who have a say, that vision for the future, and that voice and seat for young people. And that was such an important point and a very powerful point that you made there. Now, we don't have too much time for questions before we go into the Majlis, so just let me touch upon some of the questions quickly. The first one I've got here, and it's possibly one for Sir David, is one from Dr. Sarah Benison. It's the first one I've got here, which is, I'd be interested to know how much weight Indigenous customary law relating to the environment / resource extraction has in the relevant legal context. For national context, presumably approaches to customary law would depend on the legal instruments in place in each country. Sir David, is that something that you'd like to comment on?
It's not something that I can comment on in the sense that there are decisions. It is certainly true that in Canada, for example, and in Norway and Sweden and Finland, there are rights accorded to Indigenous peoples, to those who are known as Eskimos in Canada and the Sami people in the north of Norway and Sweden and Finland. But so far as I've been able to find out, there aren't any cases where rights of Indigenous people are given a special position. And in particular, in the Canadian case I mentioned, which is admittedly under appeal, there was no special right accorded to the Indigenous people who were claiming rights against Canada for failure to implement climate change restrictions. I think you'd find in Australia also that there have been special rights given to the Indigenous people of Australia, which have halted or prevented certain development activities, but so far as I know, not on the ground of climate change. But one can imagine, for example, that in the case of in a case similar to the coal mine case, then you might have some special privilege given to, if it affected particularly the Indigenous people of Australia.
Thank you, Sir David. And I put you on the spot very quickly there, but so thank you for answering that. I have another question here, which is coming from Maxins. And this is a question that actually I think I'll go to Leah first and then perhaps Ian. We don't have much time, but the question quickly is, how much do you think involvement in political institutions is linked to activism? Leah, would you have a very quick answer to that one?
I think it is linked. Like I said, I think activism is crucially important because that's what's been, I think, really creating a wake-up call to people and creating that call to action. And I do think it's super important because it shows that students want this change, that communities want this change, and it really sends a very strong message. I do think activism is one of the most vital parts that will probably need to continue to push for more ambitious goals in the future. I can't see activism ever really not having a space to really drive this.
Thank you. And Sir Ian, very briefly, you've seen things from inside government. Have you got any comments on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that activism is often linked to political institution points of view. you know, there's political idealism there, and of course this is an idealistic kind of perspective, but it's actually also a realistic perspective. So and that's where science comes in. Science brings realism to this. And you can be an activist and a scientist at the same time, but I'm not sure you can be aligned politically and be a scientist at the same time. So there's a bit of a standoff there for individuals, because scientists have to be able to explain what the evidence says, and they need to be able to explain it equally to all sides of the argument, and be trusted and believed by all sides of the argument. And if you sit on one side of that argument in an idealistic context or political context, then you won't be listened to or believed by the other side. So I think scientists have a particular role to play here, but I still think as a scientist, you can be an activist and unaligned politically.
Thank you. Well, look, can I thank you, Sir Ian, Leah and Sir David for your contributions today, very valuable. Can I thank the Scotia Group for arranging this today and for everybody coming along virtually to the University of St Andrews, and I hope in the future we'll be able to welcome you in person. I'll paraphrase Leah at the very end, if Sir Ian and Sir David don't mind, which is we need people to sustain action. And of course, my observation would be in seeing other politicians here that politicians are servants of the people. So thank you for joining us. On the run up to COP, please have a look at what's going on with Scotia. And also there are events here at the University of St Andrews around our major research themes related to sustainability, with webinars, art exhibitions, and some public outreach work as well. For those of you joining us in the Majlis, we'll see you in a couple of minutes. For everybody else, thank you so much, and great to have you with us in St Andrews. Thank you, and thanks, Annie.